Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to you. Thank you so much for joining me this whatever time you're looking at this video. I hope all of you are well. Wanted to present to you about the Gilded Age and the Progressive Era, which will take us into the period of World War One. So, what I'm going to do is I'm going to cover some of the major aspects of this period. So, when we're looking at the Gilded Age, we're looking at the period roughly from about 1880 to about 1910. 1914 is when some people would you know measure the Gilded Era. And so what we'll be doing is we're going to be looking at how this period in American history was a period of rapid change. We're talking about change technologically, change industrially, change economically, change socially, and definitely all of the confluence of all these changes that are happening at such a rapid pace, and how exactly that really forced many people in the country to question what type of America do we ultimately want to have? Is this going to be an America for just a certain group of people, or is this going to be an America for every single person where they are going to have opportunities in which to have a better life? Okay, so let's go ahead and let's get into it. So, when we think of the term the Gilded Age, this was a term that was actually coined from a book by the same title, The Gilded Age, by Mark Twain. And the reason why he used this term gilded, so if you think of anything that's gilded, if you ever um, got a chain or a piece of jewelry from somebody whom you thought you really liked, but then you wore it and then all of a sudden it left like a green ring around your neck, or maybe you wore it and it just like broke apart really too easily. Well, that's what gilded is. Gilded is like that layer. It's like a patina, something that covers something else up. And you've heard of maybe that term, not everything that glitters is gold, right? Well, this is that idea, this idea that something that is gilded, there's actually something underneath it. And what Mark Twain was referring to during this period of the Gilded Age is that while on the surface it may look good, right? There's great improvements in technology, there's new inventions, there's new ways of producing items. People are able to secure more resources and more goods. There's, opulence and opportunities to make extreme wealth. But underneath all of that, there is corruption, there's inequality, there's a lot of rot that's going on in the country. And when you think about, the Gilded Age, it's really easy to think about the romanticized version of it. There's actually a television show on HBO. It's actually by the same name, The Gilded Age, if you've watched it. And while some of the characters in there are actually real historical people, and some of the events that do take place in there actually did happen in this country, I think what it does is it really covers up. Many of the aspects of that period that Americans and America doesn't really want to, think about. Like many parts of our history, there's a lot of difficulty. There is a lot of stories that go untold. And it's easy for us to just look at this as a period of, ladies and gentlemen and parties and cotillions and, robber barons and all the like. But what is often missed out on is the fact that, this is a period of extreme inequality. There is also extreme unrest. There is a lot of partisanship in terms of politics. And so if you look at some of the characteristics that I've listed there, um, if I didn't tell you that we were looking at the period in the late 19th century, early 20th century, you might actually think that we were talking about today. I think, if you look at what's going on in our country, I mean, we have the issues of immigration, we have extreme wealth and poverty, we have expanding inequality. There's definitely more technological revolutions with AI. And we are certainly seeing more problems economically with more panics, whether that is an expanding wealth in the stock market, but then also the issue of affordability. Um, and so it's very easy for us to maybe consider that much of what was experienced well over 100 years ago is something that we're re-experiencing to this day, but it's in an exponentialized form, right? It's very much reflective of the issues that have come before us. But I think if we look at what happened during this period, um, we can actually get some sort of insight in terms of how people might react or why exactly the reactions that we're seeing today are not really random, but are actually part of a larger historical experience of, being an American under immense stress during a time of immense change and also, confusion. Um, if many of you feel confused or stressed or just plain, WTF as to what is going on in this country, the Gilded Age is probably another time for to look at because many people were feeling the same way when we look at newspapers, when we look at people's diaries, when we look at people's letters and correspondence of the age. Um, it's a period of extremes, extreme change, extreme gains, extreme losses, and I think that we're very much living in a very similar period. When we look at our government today, our policies, the opportunities that we have, and the changes that our country is going through. So let's take a look at some of the, other characteristics. So you saw some of those that were listed on the previous slide, but, there's also a lot of changes that are going on, mainly between basically what you could call two Americas, is that, you know, up until largely about 1870, 1880, most people were living, in the rural areas, and most of the country was very rural. But what we start to see is a change that, more and more people are starting to move to urban centers like Chicago, Indianapolis, parts of Ohio, Philadelphia, New York, Boston, Baltimore, Washington, D.C. And we see more and more people moving from areas of the rural central part of America, the South, up to the North and to the Midwest. And this is mainly due to some of the technological revolutions, namely like the railroad in terms of its expansion and its access to people. People have the ability to not just have to live and stay in the place where they were born, they can now move. And so what that creates is more and more urban centers, right? Now, still, just to be clear, there's still many, many people who are living in rural areas. So it's not that, everybody's leaving the countryside and going immediately to the cities. It's just that cities are starting to expand. And this is also because of another characteristic is that we have an influx of immigrants that are coming to the United States. And this is, we talked about this in the last lecture, is how the amount of immigrants that are coming into the United States, they're fleeing, various, challenges that are going on in their countries, whether it's from Europe or Mexico or from Asia. Um, and so what we're seeing is an influx depending on various regions. And so I'll show you that some on the next slide. But also this is a period of immense food production, right? Greater technology in terms of farm equipment, the ability in which to mass produce food, as well as to get food to market, is increasing the ability for more and more people to be able to live in cities because food can be produced from rural areas and it can be sent to the cities for processing. And so we see more of a production in food. And if we also want to look at is that this is also a period where technology is allowing greater extraction of our natural resources, namely iron, coal, oil, and lumber. Now remember, iron is made from several different elements, so it's not natural in the sense that it's just something like coal or oil that's in the ground. But these abilities in technology and the ability in which to forge iron, in terms of mass production to build railroads, to build buildings, to build our military, all of these aspects are happening during this period. And so when you take a look at the immigration, especially, notice the changes that are happening. Remember how I was saying that, prior to, 1880, there was a greater influx of Northern and Western Europeans, and that continues up until through 1880 and 1890 and all the way up to 1900. But where we really see a huge influx, after 1880, especially between 1890 and 1900, is a huge influx of people coming from Eastern Europe. And then this just explodes after 1900. Um, and so, this is very crucial for us to recognize because this is how it changes the framework and the dynamic of, who is arriving, right? We have Western Europeans, now we have Eastern Europeans. We have people with different languages, different religions, different cultures, and they're all arriving in these urban centers as well as, heading out to various parts of the United States. And so if you take a look at, some of the areas that these immigrants are arriving. Remember, they are coming in from largely two different areas. Um, you have the New York area, which is known as Ellis Island, and then on the West Coast, you have what is known as Angel Island. And so if you're coming from Asia, which, China, Japan, Southeast Asia, right? These areas, this is where you're going to be filtering on through, is going to be mainly through Angel Island and San Francisco. And then if you're coming from Europe, you're going to be coming in through Ellis Island in New York, past the Statue of Liberty, all of that. Maybe if you guys have seen, the film, The Godfather, part two, you've seen that area of the Italian immigrants coming in. Well, that's how millions of immigrants came into this country. But what's interesting is that take a look at the reasons that people are leaving. It's not just because of, remember, it's not just push and pull factors, that are just simply like, well, I want to have a better life. You may actually be fleeing, some sort of major problem. So, especially like health problems, we're talking about like, food shortages, poverty, disease outbreaks. Also in terms of wars, there could be conflicts that are happening. And, this is the reason why people pack up and leave. They have less opportunities. They're not likely to survive. They want to go somewhere else. And so you can also look there on the map, look and see where people are landing. You see the major areas of, Massachusetts and New York. So you're talking about New York City, you're talking about Boston, you're talking about Philadelphia and Pennsylvania. But look at the amount of people, that are coming. You have a lot of people from Germany, a lot of people from Ireland, a lot of people from Italy, right, that are arriving in areas. And especially on the West Coast, you see a huge influx of Chinese immigrants as well. So, this is very important for us to understand, how exactly did we get this idea of anti-immigrant behavior or anti-immigrant sentiment, right? Remember in our last discussion, it's not a new idea, it's not a new phenomenon, right? There is always this general disdain for the outsider. This is the idea that, yes, the United States certainly is a country of immigrants and it has a long history of immigration, but that doesn't always mean that it's welcoming to immigrants, right? It doesn't mean that, that it's like, hey, we want you guys, we want immigrants to come to this country, right? There's a sense like, yes, they're going to arrive, but that doesn't necessarily make, we're going to make it easy for the newly arrived, right? I mean, many of them are coming into large urban centers, packed into these very, overcrowded buildings. We're talking about possibilities of disease, poverty, all of the problems that come with, mass influx of a population. Okay. And what's really interesting to understand about this period is that this is the first time in American history when most people are going to be going to work for a living, right? They're going to actually be dependent upon somebody else for their wages. Whereas prior to this period, most people either worked in some sort of labor where they actually produced their own food or worked on, some sort of area where food was produced, or they lived in a very small town. And so this is where we really start to see that economy. Remember those contributing factors in terms of a strong economy, right? You have labor, you have capital, you have entrepreneurship, and you have natural resources. And so the United States has all of these things. And so this is the reason why there is that industrialization of the country and an industrial revolution where we are moving away from, people living in an agrarian nation, one that would have been pushed by, Thomas Jefferson, as opposed to one that is far more industrialized and far more urban, like the one that would have been produced or, desired by, Alexander Hamilton. But this is also very crucial for us to understand is that when you have, and as we'll see, like in the Panic of 1893, um, when you have the majority of the country dependent on wages, right, for its survival, and when there is an economic panic or collapse, we're talking about the majority of the people not being able to survive in terms of being able to eat. Okay. And so we want to think about that. Like this is the same type of society in which we have, right? We understand that we would like to think that there is a government that is, there to take care of us. But the reality is that we're really actually going to be on our own for quite some time. And we cannot depend or expect the government to come and help us. Well, this period in the during this period in the Gilded Age and then eventually the Progressive Era, this is something that actually comes to fruition with this idea that the government ought, right, ought to be an entity that actually takes care of its people or makes sure that people have the resources to be taken care of. Okay. And this is a very big fundamental change that actually takes place in this country because prior to that, it was like you're pretty much just on your own. Best of luck to you. If your farm fails, it fails. If, the business that you're working for collapses and goes under, it is what it is, right? But as we'll see, especially in the 1890s with the financial panics that become far more serious, we see that actually people end up starving to death, that people actually end up, not just, losing their livelihoods, but losing their lives as a consequence of these financial crises that largely go, not unnoticed by the government, but certainly not addressed in any sort of meaningful way, because there really is no sort of governmental response at the time. Okay. So let's take a look at that idea of like, well, where exactly does this notion come from of like, well, you know, how are people expected to survive? How are they supposed to be able to, live when there is a panic? Well, the reason why government really didn't care is because there were two prevailing ideas during this period at the end of the 19th century that really allowed people to get to this thought process that like, look, there is something about the individual in terms of their own responsibility. And it really comes from this idea of survival of the fittest, this social Darwinism, that people's failure or their success was really just determined by them, right? If you really want to have this opportunity to be able to achieve, well, then you know what? The best will achieve it, and the people who don't have who are least capable or less capable won't. Now, we all know from, just this standpoint is that this idea of social Darwinism isn't based on any sort of real fact because we know that not everybody starts off with the same resources or the same opportunities. I mean, if you take a look at the people such as Jeff Bezos or Mark Zuckerberg or Elon Musk, these are Donald Trump. None of these individuals earned their fortunes simply because of just hard work and and luck. These people had money that was invested in them. They were bequeathed some sort of large resource that allowed them that opportunity in which to acquire more resources to get them into the position that they're in. These aren't people that just pulled themselves up by their bootstraps, right? They were already pulled up. And so when you have this sense of like, well, the reason why, we are where we are, it must be because it's predetermined. It must be because there's something better about us. There must be something that we have achieved that others cannot. And what's quite interesting about that theory is that it's very much, imbued in our culture today as Americans. This idea that, well, if you really want the opportunity, you can go out there and get it if you just try. Well, we know that there's a hell of a lot more that goes into it than just that, right? We do know that people who work hard and people who, take advantage of opportunities and, take the chances that may come their way, they do have an opportunity and a chance to improve themselves. To what degree? TBD, that's to be determined. Who knows? But we also know that not everybody has access to the same resources or the same opportunities or the same education, right? We know that not everybody has the same sort of experiences. And so it's very easy for us to, simply rely on the fact like, well, they must have just worked harder. Uh, let's take a look at that and to see what that is. Because when we look at like financial panics of 1893, is it really the fact that people didn't work hard and that's the reason why they starved to death? Or is it the fact that the opportunities in which they are presented are highly limited and highly dependent on just random luck in order to be able to survive? But it's also this sense during this period, not just a social Darwinian perspective in terms of the survival of the fittest, or, that somehow the best of the best will always rise to the top. But there's also this sense of what we call laissez-faire, right? It's a French term which means just let it do. Let it go, let it be, don't touch, don't get involved, right? Just allow things to take their natural course. And this is what influences the government at this time to be like, look, we don't get involved in the markets. We don't get involved in situations of regulation. We don't get involved in that because we need to allow business to just be able to decide. We need to allow the markets to figure themselves out, and everything will be just fine, right? And so when you have this absence of an intervention, when you have this absence of, people putting in regulations, then that's the reason why we see the financial panics that we had. Now, I'm not really sure the age of any of you in this class, but if for any of those of you who were around during 2007 to 2009, during the financial crisis that not only shook this country, but also the world, that was not something that was just random. It wasn't just random that there was, predatory lending and, financial bundling of mortgage-backed securities, right? This was allowed. These weren't regulated securities, and nobody was able to do any sort of watching. And by the time that many people realized that something needed to be done, it was already too late. Lehman Brothers collapses, banks start to be insolvent, and then sooner or later you have drying up of credit. Okay, which is something that we will talk about when we talk about the Great Depression. But this idea of just allowing the government to do what it wants to do, this is the prevailing idea. Allow people the ability in which to achieve on their own. Do not get involved. The best of the best will get there at the top. So when we think of these people, and if you can see any sort of, commonality between these individuals on this screen here, no, it shouldn't be obvious to you. It shouldn't be that hard to determine, right? They're all men, they're all white, right? And these are some of the biggest names that are associated with this period. You have J.P. Morgan right there. You have Andrew Carnegie. You have Henry Ford, right? Cornelius Vanderbilt, John D. Rockefeller, etc. Right? These are individuals whom, actually, are characterized with this period in terms of mass production, industrialization, inventions, as well as accumulating massive amounts of wealth. Okay, so let's take a look at some of these individuals. Now, just so you know, on every single one of these screens, if you actually click on it, it'll take you to a documentary about that individual. So if you just want to get any more information about these individuals, that's fine. I'm not gonna, give you guys any sort of like specifics about each of them, when it comes to like the midterm or anything like that. But it's just good to know like how these people made their money, what was their business practices, who they are, if you're just curious to understand, these individuals. So, Cornelius Vanderbilt, railroads. That's how he made all of his money. And, basically, his approach was, very simple is that, he would just buy out the competition. He'd undercut his competitors. He was in transportation prior to the railroads. He was into steamboats. And he also had made, his money also in slavery as well. So, it's not to say that this is an individual who was like, oh, so beneficent and generous that he just, made it without, made it with, out with any sort of help. This is an individual who actually comes from, resources, right? Now, did he take the resources that he had and turn them into more? Sure, he did. So he had some opportunities there. And he's also responsible for, donating, money to found and create Vanderbilt University, which is in Tennessee. If you ever can go there, it's in Nashville. It's a really beautiful university. And he's also responsible for building Grand Central Station in New York. So if you've ever been there, if you've ever taken the train up from Baltimore and taken it into New York, that's exactly where you pull in. So they're responsible for that. If you look at somebody like John D. Rockefeller, he's the one who founded Standard Oil, and he created what is known as a trust. Trusts that we will see, become illegal. They become highly regulated after they were responsible for creating monopolies. Because at the time, a trust was seen as something that didn't need to be regulated, right? It was basically an agreement. Between various stockholders as well as other companies to where stock would be issued in return for the individual, this case John D. Rockefeller, to make decisions to control all forms of production, manufacturing, as well as dissemination of the services. So in this case, Standard Oil. And so, if you want to, think about, the incredible mass amounts of wealth, I mean, you're talking about somebody who basically had their hand in everything. He was the first billionaire. If he was still alive, he'd be well worth over, 300 billion today. But, he also gave money to, in New York, that would be the place where the United Nations now sits. He also gave money to the University of Chicago. He also donated to, other aspects, in terms of foundations and XYZ. So, it's massive, absolutely massive. But, he really gets involved in creating, and controlling the modes of production in terms of oil. And when you become the head and the decision maker and all of the money is flowing to you, you get to set the price. You get to decide. You can basically outbid or outperform, or you can amass amounts of, land and resources that just allows you to be able to be in charge. And so, it's very important to be able to to look at those achievements in terms of the opportunities in which they created, because the amount of wealth that Rockefeller and people like Vanderbilt and Carnegie, all they create, is that this is all transferred wealth, right? This isn't just disseminated back out into the people who helped him earn it. This is transferred into his families. Now, there is one individual who actually did actually, achieve, um, who was born poor, born in Scotland, and his family immigrates from Scotland to the United States. And, Carnegie is an interesting sort of character. Take a look at uh the documentary on him, because as well as the documentary titled The Gilded Age, they have a really interesting section on him. Because Carnegie, he did truly work hard. He had a knack for numbers. He had a knack for figuring things out. Was he maybe in the right place at the right time? Certainly. But he was an individual who was intensely curious. After he had made his fortune in terms of steel, he really became curious as to how he got this way. And he spends, his time after he's, a multimillionaire, really just traveling the world and studying world religions and philosophy, trying to figure out, these notions of like why exactly he achieved so much as opposed to others. And he believes in this idea of the social gospel. He believes in social Darwinism. It's all of these aspects. But the thing about Carnegie that's different from his from other robber barons and competitors of the period is that he actually gave a lot of most of his wealth away. The Carnegie Foundation, whether it's Carnegie Mellon Institute, or if it's some of the other aspects in terms of the libraries, or the huge amount of resources that he put back into universities and education, opportunities such as that, his legacy endures in that way. And so, when we think of like philanthropy, it's interesting because, individuals during this period in the late 19th century, early 20th century saw philanthropy in the mode of creating those resources that other people could enjoy. So, libraries, museums, parks, right? It's very interesting that when you look at the individuals today, who are creating, who are amassing huge amounts of wealth, that they're not exactly, philanthropists in that way. They're not, you do have Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, right? And they donate to, major causes, in terms of healthcare and education and whatnot. But stuff like, individuals like Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, heck, uh, even individuals that are, part of Google or Facebook or Twitter, all of the, or not Twitter anymore, sorry, X, right? You don't see Mark Zuckerberg donating, to major causes, right? It was even his wife that had to get him to donate to the hospital at Stanford, right? I mean, this new round of, billionaires, um, it's not the same. They don't see the ways of creating resources for others. They see that, well, if I create a resource in terms of technology, if I create a resource in terms of AI, if I create a resource in terms of the ability for us to travel better or to live better, that's the way to do it. Which, you could have your discussions and perspectives on that, but I would ask you guys to compare. Think about, what is the value in terms and the legacy, that a billionaire like Carnegie, Vanderbilt, Rockefeller, in terms of universities, being founded or donated, right? That you're going to donate, to a library, that you're going to make sure that this is being owned. I mean, it's very different, when you put your name on a building, as our president is trying to do, like, oh, I want an airport named after me. Well, it's like, you naming after an airport is like, what do you want people to remember? I mean, I have an airport that, that Trump should definitely be named after. It's called Dulles Airport, be one of the worst airports in the country, because if you've ever been stuck there, please name it after our current president. That would be very fitting. Nothing ever works over there, and you're most likely to lose your luggage. So it is what it is. Okay. What also I want to understand is, especially with Carnegie, is that one of the things that you have to look at in terms of this idea of monopolies, and this is Rockefeller as well as Vanderbilt, is this idea of what we call integration, right? We have what is known as vertical integration, where we go from bottom to top or top down. And we also have horizontal integration, which means that we cover all broad areas of those resources. So when we look at horizontal integration, what we're talking about here is we're talking about the natural resources, right? So if we want to look at, oil, for instance, right? Coal. You want to look at land, lumber, water, whatever the case may be, whatever that resource is that you need. So if you take somebody like Carnegie, like in terms of steel, well, he's going to need oil. He's also going to need other chemicals, and he's going to need a lot of resources that are going to be found in the natural wilds of the United States as well as around the world. So he wants to be able to create this horizontal integration where he has control or his companies have either a dominant area in that market to be able to extract that resource, right? So if I'm able to own all of these areas in terms of these resources, this is what allows me to be able to control how much this is going to cost in terms of the ultimate product that I'm going to be able to produce. Now, in terms of vertical integration, what we're talking about is what we do with the oil in terms of producing it into what we would use in terms of gasoline, right? How we get that thing to the consumer. So what we're doing is we're looking at the extraction of the natural resource, the transportation of that resource, the processing of it, then the transportation again, and then finally the selling to the consumer, right? So if we can control all of these areas if I can control both the way that it's extracted and the way that it's ultimately produced, right? Horizontal, all the resources that come into the extraction of those materials, the raw materials, and then the vertical in terms of how it's ultimately produced. If I can control both of these or have a stronger influence over it, I've got a monopoly, otherwise known as a trust. Okay. And so this is what essentially people like Vanderbilt, Rockefeller, Carnegie, all of these individuals are doing, right? They are basically figuring out how can I amass and control all of these resources so that I can set the price and make the determining factors of how this is going to, benefit me. Okay. Now, if you're curious and think about this in terms of that horizontal integration, in terms of resources, you've actually heard a lot about this lately if you've been watching the news with our president. We went in to Venezuela, and while the news reports are that we were extracting a criminal that we needed to prosecute into New York federal court, we know very well that Venezuela is the largest producing oil country in our hemisphere. Okay, so that is a way of looking at this horizontal integration that the United States wants to control or have an influence over the way that that oil is going to be extracted. Now, even our president said that very clearly the day after that President Maduro was taken to New York, is that we're here for the oil. We want to have our companies go down into that area and help develop it. Now, of course, you've heard him say like, oh yeah, we're also going to help the Venezuela people and blah, 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 blah. Yeah, where have we heard that before? Okay, right? We heard that during the Iraq-Afghanistan war. We've heard that in terms of any of the other wars that the CIA has been involved in, whether it was in Chile, Mossadegh in Iran, all the parts of, Patrice Lumumba in Zaire, like all of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, then later Zaire, like it's the same narrative, right? So don't be fooled. But there's clearly one goal: horizontal integration. We want to try to get amassing these resources. What's the other country that Trump is interested in acquiring? Greenland, right? Not just oil, but minerals. Minerals that are used in all of our electronics, all of our computer chips, all of those resources located in Greenland. So you can see that this horizontal integration is being, determined through military might, right? Through influence in areas like that. The vertical integration is also something that President Trump is, very interested and concerned about. So if you've heard him say this idea that we want to bring manufacturing back to the United States, not it's not a bad idea. It's just a short-sighted idea because that's not how manufacturing works in this country anymore. This is a country that, most likely designs, products and then they're produced somewhere else. So he wants to be able to bring that sort of integration back to the United States, basically that number three area. He wants that processing to be back here, right? Process our own oil, process our own cobalt, process our own copper, process everything that we do so that we can produce it for ourselves and then sell it back out to another country. Not a bad idea, just kind of a difficult because if you don't have the infrastructure here to be able to produce it. So for instance, when we look at what we call rare earth minerals, right? Rare earth minerals pretty much are only processed in one major country in the world. I'm sure it won't take you guys long to figure out which that is. It's China, right? Which would be one of the reasons why President Trump wants to be able to create it here. Why? Because he feels that it poses an economic as well as a national security threat. Okay, not a bad idea. Well, how are you going to bring that sort of manufacturing back here? We don't have the resources, that number three, that processing ability, and that will take decades in order to rebuild that back up. So, it certainly does. Trump and his advisors have some sort of perspectives, but for us here, you could look at this idea of wanting to have horizontal integration as well as vertical integration in the policies that President Trump is pushing at this moment. Okay. Finances. Pierpont Morgan. Any of you guys bank at Chase? This is the guy. Okay. So if you're interested, This individual here, okay, he is his father was an immigrant from England, and he actually Morgan was actually trained and he studied in England. He actually learned finances there, learned it from his father. What he learned most importantly, though, from his business dealings was the value in terms of being able to control finances, right? This ability to be able to create mergers, corporations, to take over businesses that were having difficulty and to organize them. What's fascinating is that there is if you look at the documentary on the Gilded Age, and there's a great discussion there about Morgan and how he goes, um, when we're having a financial panic in the late 1890s, basically what was happening is that the currency was collapsing. And this was, causing problems in the credits and, the abilities for businesses to do business. And so Pierpont Morgan really is responsible for, saving the United States because at the time, remember, there is no FDIC, there is no federal bank, there's nothing to regulate these markets to be able to prevent them from collapsing. But what Morgan understood is that, hey, if I can help to be able to stabilize this, it certainly benefits me because I've got all this money. My investors have all this money, friends like me have all this money. This is what we're going to be able to do. What's interesting though is that as an investor, he also helped build off of Cornelius Vanderbilt in terms of not just the railroad companies. Is that one of the things that Pierpont Morgan realized with the railroad companies is that it was very difficult to be able to predict, when goods and services and how much they would cost on various rail lines, because depending on who owned the rail line and what line and what area of the line they controlled, the price could be go up or down. And what Morgan realized is that many times people would actually build rail lines right next to each other, right? And so he saw this as entirely inefficient. He was like, this has to change. So we have to be able to get rid of this and be able to say, like, look, we're going to agree on certain aspects of competition. Now, remember that laissez-faire idea? Well, you should just let it figure out, and whoever's the best will get there. For Morgan, that just didn't make any sense. He's like, this doesn't make sense. We have to be able to change this so that we can have some sort of standardization, because one of the things that is so difficult for businesses is that when businesses don't have reliable, stable information to be able to make decisions to which they can know how to invest and how much to put in, how much to buy, how much to sell, they can't do business. This is the reason why the tariffs are very difficult. Or when President Trump was constantly saying, I'm going to raise tariffs or I'm going to lower tariffs, I'm going to do this, right? That makes it very difficult for businesses to be able to respond. They're not sure if they have to buy this much or sell this much, or should they stay open, should they close, right? Same thing during this period. If you can't have regulation with the railroads, if you don't know how much things cost, businesses is not going to be able to thrive. So he actually was able to get a lot of the railroad companies together and to be like, look, we're going to make a merger and we're going to decide who's going to get what so that we can get this, figured out. But like some of his counterparts, Morgan did give money to museums. That was his big thing. If you've been to the Met, in New York, or if you've been to the Museum of Natural History, those, many of those original buildings that are still there, he was responsible for contributing to that. Now, besides robber barons, remember this period is also one about individuals who are inventors, right? Technology. And so you have people like Thomas Edison, inventor of the light bulb, the phonograph, right? The ability in which to, record a voice and then to have it played back out for you, right? Well over 1,000 patents and other inventions, and, helped create General Electric in 1889. An individual who was, constantly out there. Remember, the light bulb and other technologies like this by Thomas Edison, this was something that helps improve the ability to live, right? If we can live by, light, we are able to work longer into the night. If we can, heat our homes, if we have the ability in which to, record, right? These are things that allow us to be able to have a lifestyle that improves our ability to produce, right? But it also creates other aspects, right, in terms of our society, right? If we become far more dependent on technology. Alexander Graham Bell. Remember, we're talking about the first telephone. Individual makes the first phone call. You can actually hear a recording of the first phone call on YouTube. It's actually, quite cool. But he came up with other things. One of the founding inventors, or I guess you could say thinkers, mind creators of aeronautics, also metal detectors, and so helped found AT&T. So if any of you got your phone with the AT&T company like me and are constantly wondering like why doesn't it work, we have Alexander Graham Bell, at least to thank for the process of getting us to the phone. I can't necessarily blame him for the terrible coverage because I don't know if he had necessarily envisioned something like that. But let's get to somebody like Henry Ford, right? And why is Henry Ford so important? Well, it's not just the fact that Henry Ford, was mass producing, Model Ts and was able to lower the price of vehicles, which give more people access to resources to move and to travel, X, Y, and Z. But it's really this idea of specialization, this idea of being able to create a extremely complicated product on an assembly line where each individual has one or two tasks that they are supposed to do as a part of their job, right? A specialization. So rather than building a car from, start to finish, as, was the case, prior to the invention of automobiles, we had people who would build, or make a shoe by hand, make clothing by hand, make various, goods and services by hand. Now we can mass produce them with each person having a specialty. No need to teach them the entire craft. No need for you to be an apprentice for several years in order before you take over. Now you just have to have some sort of skill, one skill or two, that can be able to tell you how to do this. Turn this knob, put this wheel on, tighten this screw, right? And as it moves down, and over a period of time, you have an entire vehicle that is built, right? So it lowers the cost, it increases the productivity, mass production of these items. And so what's very interesting here is that, this is something that, his invention of this idea of the assembly line and mass production, this goes into all areas of manufacturing. And so what you have is the mass production of goods all over, shoes, clothing, anything for your home, right? And this is what's going to be, take us well into the 20th century with production. But it's also very important for us to know that, Henry Ford during this, during his period of time, especially, in the 1920s and 1930s, this is a person, with, severe, anti-Semitic views. He's actually an individual who uses his wealth not just to, give to museums and hospitals, but he also used his wealth in order to, publish or republish a written work called The International Jew. And he actually, produced this work as a way to create and spread anti-Semitism throughout the United States. And we'll see this in the when we get to the period after World War One and we leading up from the Great Depression into World War II, we'll talk about this some more. But I don't want you to just think that this is an individual with, such great, ideas and, without his faults, because he certainly had plenty. I mean, even at the hospital that Henry Ford, had founded, he made it a policy that no Jews could be hired there. I mean, this is real. I mean, this is historically real. I'm not making this up. And so it's important for us to know that yes, can humans create some really incredible stuff? They can. They can also be extremely hateful and hurtful as well. And so that's the problem. That's the challenge that we have with history, is that we have to reconcile that as we learn it, to reconcile who this man was, and what exactly is his legacy and what exactly are the issues. I mean, maybe even some of you have seen some of the jokes on Family Guy that they've made about people like, Henry Ford, when he talks about, the car, but I think he calls it what does he call it? I think he calls it the Jew crusher or something like that. It's something, look it up on YouTube, you know. But it's like and so he just says like it's for running over Jews. But you know, the people are like, well, you could use it for something else. And what it is that it gets at the aspect of who this man was as a part, you know, of himself, right? That he was somebody who had held extremely racist and anti-Semitic views, but he is also an individual who had some ideas for ingenuity that could fundamentally change the way that we produce goods and services. So, you know, have to look at that. History is always complicated. It's never always rosy and beautiful, right? There's some difficulties here, and so we have to be able to look at that. Finally, of course, we have the Wright brothers. And of course, you know, don't blame them for, you know, how cramped it is on a plane and you know how terrible it is when we, you know, why they're yelling at us and why we're not taking off on time. Let's just look at the simple fact that, you know, Orville and Wilbur, you know, Wright, you know, we're really looking at, you know, how flight, you know, could be something that could be possible, right? And, you know, this is what, you know, takes off with aeronautics and, you know, the other inventions that would come later. Okay. So all of this aspect, and if you look at the if you look at the the documentary on the Gilded Age, one of the things that I want you to think about is with all of these inventors, with all of these robber barons, with all of this, is there's a huge amount of wealth that's coming in. You have people who are amassing massive amounts of wealth and are creating huge, you know, changes in our society, whether in terms of what we produce, how we live, right? But we are also, remember, the reason why people like Rockefeller and Carnegie and, you know, Vanderbilt are able to produce these massive amounts of wealth is because off of the backs of immigrants. You know, people who are working in their steel mills or working in the, you know, forging for iron or working, you know, on the railroads. You know, these are the work of immigrants. And so immigrants is what's driving. Remember, that's that labor aspect, right? Cheap labor is what is driving this economy. You have natural resources, an abundance. We have a cheap labor, an influx from, you know, Europe as well as Asia. Then we have entrepreneurs, people like Carnegie and Rockefeller and, you know, and Vanderbilt. And then we also have the capital, right? We have manufacturing plants. We have the resources in which to produce this and to produce these goods and services. Okay. So think about it like this is that yes, people are getting more opportunities. There's more opportunities to work and there's, you know, opportunities there, but there's also severe opportunities in terms of inequality, that this massive amounts of wealth that's happening is not being equally shared. Not everybody is benefiting from this. And so what's important for us to understand is that this extreme wealth, these achievements in industry and business, right, is done because there's really no regulation, right? Remember, laissez-faire. Government isn't involved. There's no income tax. There's no wealth tax. There's no property taxes, right, or anything like that, right? This is because there's no regulations. These people who are wealthy, they're pretty much going to stay this way, and they're just going to transfer their wealth, and they're just going to keep getting wealthier. Whereas the poorest and the most vulnerable are really just not going to have many opportunities, right? And so what we see during this period is, you know, an America that is really, you have two Americas. You have an America of opportunity, you know, people with wealth, people who are, you know, there is a middle class, certainly a business class, and there's, you know, an elite. But then there's also extreme poverty and extreme inequality. You have children working in factories. You have unsafe working conditions. You have, you know, people, you know, literally are being, you know, hurt and mangled on the job, or they could be, you know, fired at a whim, right? And so when we think about this, you really have this America of, yes, there's America for opportunity, and then there's an America that's just completely destitute. And that should be something that you should think about right now is that are we also in two Americas, right? Is there an America? Because if you look at what President Trump, you know, keeps saying about the economy, you know, he's saying like, well, yeah, the stock market is doing great. And, you know, stocks have never been better. And, you know, employment is good and everything else, right? So why is everybody complaining? What is the problem? Well, not everybody, only about 40%, 40 to 50% of Americans have money in the stock market, right? So it's not the majority of Americans. And the majority of Americans, aren't necessarily having jobs that allow them the ability in which to sustain during periods of cost increases, right? You've heard this term affordability, right? Where does this come from? But you've gone to the grocery store, right? Most of us pretty much just buy the same things over and over again. But you've noticed that what you're buying, even though it hasn't changed in terms of the quantity, it certainly has changed in terms of the price. And so when President Trump is saying like, well, I don't understand, gas prices are this, the economy, the stock market is doing this. People live in an economy that is daily. If you're daily reminded that the cost of bread, cereal, milk, eggs, medicine, right, travel is all going up, and yet your wages are staying the same, you feel stagnant, right? There's a part of America that is doing very well, right? The people who are at the top, the people who have the most resources to make more money, they're doing just fine. But the rest of us, we're not doing too well. We're not doing too well because the cost of which it takes for us to survive is going up. And so we have less and less of a chance to be able to save, to get ahead, to make that opportunity, right? What you hear with like the affordability in terms of homes, in terms of rent, right? In terms of these resources, right? It's going up. And so do many of you have one or two jobs? Sure. Some of you guys taking on extra work? Absolutely. Right. And so what we want to do is that this period, much like the one that we're living in now, this was often brought to light by other people who we rely on for this information, namely journalists. Journalists would often call into question what's going on in society. And this would actually create such a fervor amongst the population that politicians would ultimately have to respond, right? So if you look at some of what is going on in Minneapolis right now, whether it's the recording by, bystanders or people who are holding ICE accountable, journalists that are reporting on this, and then this information getting to various political leaders, and then hopefully they do something about it. Who knows, right? This is what we want to see is that during this period of the 1880s, 1890s, 1900s, we had greater awareness of what was going on because of technology. We have the ability in which to rapidly transmit information, whether through the telegraph, whether we have the ability in which to record information through a photograph, right? The ability in which to print information in newspapers. And literacy is actually quite high during this period. So we have people who are able to get more and more information about what's going on, which means that there is a greater awareness of the condition in which we live in, right? Similar to where we are now. Many of us see that our problems are shared by many people in this country, and we want to be able to try to create, that sense of, unity behind that. What separates us is how we have like the same technology, that social media that is creating those insulated ideas, right? You can get down into, a rabbit hole of just certain information or a certain way of thinking or a certain way of seeing the world, right? And so this is the reason why it's very important for us to look and see how exactly did the 19th century in the 19th century, how did they try to expand people's awareness? So let's take a look. So when we think about progressive era, right? When we think about what was going on, remember, you've got these people at the top producing, right? You have literally no regulation of what's happening in terms of the way that goods and services are produced, how food is produced, all of these aspects. And so what's interesting for us to know is that prior to this, here's a couple things that you could do. You could mislabel products. You could advertise things that were inaccurate. You could sell expired food. You could, give contaminated or poisonous things to the public, right? You didn't have to have fire escapes. You could, there was no rules in terms of like, the working day, right? We're talking about like 12, 13 hours, right? Children, 5 or 6 years old can work in the coal mines, right? It's, a company could own everything to produce a product. And there was no insurance in terms of banks regulation, there was no taxes, there was no nothing, right? And just so you know, senators at this time were not even directly voted by the people. They are voted in by the other elected officials at the state level. So any of your state representatives, they would vote for their senator to represent them at the national level. Okay, so in the progressive era, we're going to see how all of this is addressed. And this is what's very important is that because in this Gilded Age, you have a period of extreme wealth, extreme poverty, extreme inequality. And because this area starts to get people to question, is this the America that we want? Do we ultimately want an America that's two Americas, one for the elites who have everything and the other group who has nothing? Or are we going to be in America where it's going to be an America that can work for everyone? And this is where the progressive era, starts to come in with aspects of being able to create more regulations, more standards, more opportunities that are in areas of protection, the ability for people to be able to have a better life. Okay. So, one of the first things that starts the progressive era in terms of regulations, in terms of finances, is what I had mentioned earlier, the Panic of 1893. Okay. So, this is really spurred on by the railroads. Okay. And because of what I had mentioned with the lack of regulation that was going on in terms of competition and the ability for prices not to be stabilized, this creates an issue in terms of our currency and eventually the gold standard. And there was questions at the time in terms of like, should we go off the gold standard? Should we add silver to it? Right? All of these different aspects that this creates essentially a lack of confidence in the system, which causes the economy to literally plummet. Um, and what's interesting about this is that when you think of any sort of economic issues, that happen in our country, is that our economy is always based off of one thing, and that's faith. Faith. The idea that the money that you have in your bank account is going to be there, right? That a dollar is going to be worth this much and that it'll be able to buy this and this. People have faith in this system. Now, we often just take it for granted because we're so used to it, right? Well, when people start to lose faith in the system, right, that money isn't worth the same as it was, that the services aren't going to come, that I'm not going to get paid, right? People's behaviors start to change. And if the behaviors start to change, then that affects the general economy, right? If you know what credit is, right? Credit is based off of the Latin word for credo, which means trust, right? This idea that I trust that you're going to do what you're supposed to do and that I'll give you credit in order to do that. Well, when in 1893, when there is a loss of trust in the system, a loss of confidence in the system, people's behaviors start to change. And what ends up happening is that the first runs on the banks start to happen. People literally, as we'll see, this happens in the early 1930s as well. We call them bank runs. You can see it there at the bottom there, where people literally are running into the bank to try to pull out their cash, right? Well, when you pull out the money out of a bank, it loses its liquidity and then the bank fails, right? Now remember, there is no regulation here, right? If banks are failing, banks can't lend money out. They can't, support their creditors. They can't support, so then they go under, right? And so if the banks fail, this leads to job losses. This leads to foreclosures, right? If there's job losses, that means the unemployment goes up. And if there's unemployment, and we're talking like 17 to 20% here, massive unemployment, 2 out of every 10 people unemployed. Now remember, over 50% of the people in this country depend on wages for their survival. So if they don't have any money, then they don't have anything to eat. Literally, this is what leads people to starve. Okay. And this is the reason why there had to be some sort of reform, right? There had to be some sort of monetary policy where we can regulate the banks, where there would be a requirement for banks to be able to have so much money on hand that they couldn't just necessarily loan out more than they actually had. They couldn't flub their books, right? And so this is one of the first periods when we actually see, because in 1893, this panic was massive. It actually lasts for 2 years, right? And so what we're talking about here is we're talking a major loss in terms of capital, production, employment, opportunities, and ultimately people do die as a result of this. Okay? People freeze to death because they have no coal in which to burn, right? They starve to death because they don't have anything to eat, right? And so what's important for us to look at is that prior to this period, the panics, yeah, they always happened, but they were never this widespread. Why? Because the majority of people didn't depend on a company in which for their survival. Now they do. And so now what people are looking at during this period of reform is that, well, we need to change this. There needs to be some sort of regulation. We need to have controls. We can't just allow people to just do whatever they want. Laissez-faire clearly doesn't work. Look at what happens to us. Because if we just don't do anything, the systems are vulnerable to failure. Okay? So, when we look at what was done as a response to this, now remember this is 1893, so it took a little while, but prior to that, prior to the panic of 1893, we had one of the processes known as the Sherman Antitrust Act, right? This was the first step to regulate the monopolies, right? Is that you can't just have one company controlling everything. Why? Because if that company goes under, then everybody suffers, right? We can't have that. So these things had to be broken up. And so this was one of the first steps towards the progressive era, which was to regulate corporate trusts, right? You can't just have all this. You have to be able to break it up. This is the reason why people are quite concerned. How many different phone companies do we have? Cell phone companies. Verizon, AT&T, what else? Sprint. I don't even think the Sprint is around anymore. Correct me if I'm wrong. What do they got? Cricket or something like that? Whatever the case may be. Notice that we don't have like 10 different companies, right? You really have the choice between like T-Mobile, Verizon, and AT&T. You got three different choices. Well, I don't know how many of you have ever said this, but I've never said this. I've never said to myself, like, man, I really, really love my streaming service and my cable company, or I really love my phone company. And why is that? Because it pretty much, or like, I really like the bank that I bank with, right? I mean, why is that? Because pretty much all banks, all, phone companies, and cable companies are the same, right? They're really no different. Hell, I'll give you guys this example for those of you who are old enough, if you've ever heard of this, we used to call them rollover minutes. Okay, so this was prior to the time when we had unlimited data. Okay, where we actually had time periods when people would have heightened calls or less calls. While I am actually still on one of those AT&T family plans from back in 2001. I still have the same one. My brother and myself, we still have the same one. And they have been wanting us to change this for longest. And why is that? Well, I'll tell you why. It's because they're losing money. But I still get a bill that says, like, hey, you have 240,321 rollover minutes. And it's actually quite humorous because this is the way that things used to be done, is there actually used to be regulation in this aspect. But back then, we actually had more competition. There were more companies that we could actually choose from. Now we don't have much of a choice. And without much of a choice, we don't have as much competition, which means if there's no competition, that means that there's actually less quality that goes on in there, right? And so this is one of the things that you guys want to consider is that when you have something like the Sherman Antitrust Act, this was meant to create more competition. If there's more competition, the product gets better, the services are better for the people, right? That was the whole idea. Well, other legislation that would eventually be passed in both 1913 and 1914 is that you had the Federal Reserve Act in 1913, right before we entered into World War One. Because remember, the Federal Reserve Act was meant to create a central banking system. Okay. Prior to that, prior to 1913, we didn't have one. Okay. In 1893, there is no central bank, right? There's no government that is whole job is to make sure that, unemployment stays low, inflation stays low, right? That the currency is a good value, right? We don't have anything like that in 1893. And so this whole idea of establishing a Federal Reserve, as you've seen our president get upset with the current chairman, Jerome Powell, that he wants lower interest rates on mortgages. Well, lower interest rates on mortgages would be a great idea. Here's the problem. if people have lower interest rates on mortgages, they also have more money. If they pour more money into the system, that means that the value of the services, in terms of the value of the money, the currency goes down because there means there's more of an influx in the actual system, right? When you have more money in the system passing itself around, the value goes down, right? And so then this is what ends up happening is that you have your money is worth less, right? Is that because people are now vying for and they have more money to burn. So now we're going to be trying to spend and the prices are going to go up. More money is going to go into the circulation and we're going to have a huge problem, another economic problem. So this is one of the things that we needed with the Federal Reserve is that we needed an organization that was going to help regulate that. So that comes as to pass. Okay. Other things to look at in terms of the progressive area that was addressed, right? We call them political machines. And if you take a look at the Gilded Age, aspect, and actually, if you also click on this link here, this will actually take you to Boss Tweed and some aspects about him in terms of the New York politics and New York political machines at the time, right? Political machines were meant to regulate services, right? If you want to think of like John D. Rockefeller and Carnegie, regulating, steel or oil, political machines like the one run by, Tammany Hall and William Boss Tweed is that his job was to make sure is that services, right, and that resources were going to his people, right? Now, was there extreme fraud? Absolutely. Were people voting multiple times? Of course they were. Was there aspects in terms of political corruption? Absolutely. There was also other aspects that Boss Tweed was associated with, which they called honest graft, meaning that he often used his position politically to create opportunities for people. So, for instance, he would use his money to be able to make sure that on the coldest, winter nights and, the coldest periods of the year, that there would be almshouses open with heat, that he would make sure that that people wouldn't be kicked out onto the streets if they didn't pay their rent, that he would create more regulations, or that he would deal with the landlords, or that he would also, buy land for public works projects, whether they are parks or for boulevards or, things like that. So yes, did he favor businesses and local businesses to do these? Yes. But then the aspect is that it goes to benefit the people, right? It puts people to work. It gives people jobs. It creates communities, right? So there's this, once again, not everything is going to be great. Not everything is going to be equal. Not everything is rosy, right? These are the complicated things with history. So when we look at those political machines, but also think about it today, right? I mean, let's look at, political kickback and let's look at everything else. I mean, in case you guys are wondering, every single one of our senators, all 100 of them, every single one of them is a millionaire. None of them are broke. Okay. So it's not like they came to Washington and were just like, oh, hey, I came here to do service for the people. These are people who get a lot of money for their position. And they usually get a lot of money based off of people wanting to get access to them to be able to influence their vote. We call these people lobbyists, and lobbyists on behalf of various organizations, whether it's oil companies or business companies or, people who, produce X, Y, and Z. These are people who want to get access to these individuals. Hell, we see it right now with the current, political position of our president. I mean, whether it's his Bitcoin, or whether he's using his hotels, or he's using, his name to enrich himself. There it is, right there. It's very similar to what was going on in the 1880s through the 1920s, right? Is that you have individuals that who are involved in various political, graft. And, this hasn't changed. We'd like to think that our political leaders are, thinking about us. And I think that in some respects, we do get a benefit from that, but let's not forget how much money these individuals make and who actually is paying them. Okay. So if you take a look at some of the bribes, if you take a look at some of the corruption, Senator Bob or former Senator Bob Menendez is a good example, or just look at the, relationship, with our president and other countries, whether he's being gifted a 747 from Qatar or whether he's, being wined and dined by various, organizations that want, his ability. I mean, heck, even look at the Melania documentary. I mean, Amazon paid $70 million, 30 million of which went directly to Melania Trump. I mean, from Amazon, I mean, does Amazon have a lot to gain from certain, political decisions of this administration? Oh, you bet he does, right? Because the one thing that these organizations and businesses and businessmen, whether it's the 1880s and 1890s or today, they do not like regulation that limits their ability to make money. And so if they're going to pay people to be able to get more money, they're going to do it. Okay. So this period is something that is brought to the attention, right? We have this to thank for because of journalism, right? Journalists during this period use newspapers, they use pamphlets, they use books. And, one of the things that I want you guys to think about is this term, what is known as muckraking, right? It's known for a type of journalism that has a strongly investigative editorial voice, but it goes into the process of exposing what's going on, right? This is that nastiness under that gilded patina, right? That Mark Twain was talking about, right? That this is that period where you're just like, wow, that's what people were doing. So like if you're taking a look at like Upton Sinclair's, work The Jungle that exposes, meat packing, where they're literally grinding up rats into the meat, or the meat has been sitting for several days and is rotting, and they spray it with some sort of formaldehyde or poison, or, whether it is some sort of process that exposes the inequity in a factory. This was what got people to start questioning and maybe asking for more change. And so let's take a look at some of those people. So some of the people that are listed here, take a look at Ida Tarbell. She was the one who exposed the corruption with Standard Oil and John D. Rockefeller. Jacob Riis, he was a photojournalist, took many of those pictures that we saw of kids living in squalor, kids in factories, tenement houses. Ida B. Wells, her activism in terms of her red record, where she documents lynching in the South. Extremely important in terms of her contributions of the newspaper, The Free Speech, right? That tabulated these statistics to document the violence that was common during this period. All of these things in terms of fraud that's exposed, right? These are things that are put into newspapers and pamphlets that are read widely. Right. So people begin to see that it's like, look, my situation isn't unique. It's actually systematic, right? Very similar to what we're doing. We're all paying too much for groceries. We're all paying too much for rent. We're all paying this. So the question is what's going to be done about it? Notice, oh, and take a look, if you actually click on, some of these links, you can actually see, some of this, like how the food was poisoned and in certain exposés. And also, take a look at the documentary that I put up called The Poison Squad. It's really quite fascinating. How, the Food and Drug Administration eventually, is founded, but also why. It's fascinating to know, like, wow, we could really literally sell this to people. And it was just, this sense of like, well, good luck to you. Hope you buy something that doesn't kill you. It's like, it's like that, that's that movie that's out. What is it? It's like good luck, have fun, don't die. That's basically what it was like buying food in the 1890s. And it's like whatever, it is what it is. Hope you don't die with what you're eating, right? But it's important for you guys to question that, right? We often take it's like, oh, we assume that we're buying something off the shelf that it's safe, right? Well, that's only because we have organizations that are tested to do that. But when you have somebody who's president and they want to cut down on these regulations, history teaches us is that companies usually aren't that honest, and that they're more than willing to, sell something late. I mean, what's interesting is that I was in a Harris Teeter, I think it was 2 weeks ago, And the normally what would happen is that anything that was like that expired that day would have been taken off the shelf like 2 or 3 days ago, right? I ended up buying orange juice that was expired that day or should have been sold by that day. It was bad the next day, right? So now it's like, oh, well, you can clearly see what their practices are. So, I mean, as a consumer, I'm just not going to shop there. We don't really have many opportunities for choices in the area that I live in. Um, but it is what it is. But this is very similar. It's like, well, the consumer has to take a chance. But we have journalists that actually help us. And we actually have many journalists today that still do this today, that are helping us, to identify some of the problems that's going on in our government, that's going on at the state level, that's the local level, right? ProPublica is a great one. The Intercept, also, investigative reporters and editors, take a look. Okay. And the food regulation aspect, Harvey Washington Wiley that talk about in the documentary The Poison Squad, fascinating stuff. Take a look at it. He's a chemist. Wanted to try to understand, this idea of food safety in terms of regulation. But it's important for us to understand this. Like, where does this come from? I mean, we assume that it's like because I, bought this and that it was bottled, that it wasn't, fake and that, that sound that comes out, it's like, oh, okay, it's okay. That I don't think about taking a sip and is it going to kill me? Right? Because we have regulations and rules that prevent that from happening. Doesn't mean that always people don't get sick, but you see all those food recalls that come in, right? If you bought something at, a Trader Joe's or a Costco or Walmart, and they're like, hey, if you bought this, please come back in and we'll give you a refund. Why? Because something got into the processing of it, right? Something got into it that has made people sick. So the person who, and you can click on the food regulation right here, and it'll take you to this that documentary. I've also put it on the link as well. Okay. So when we think of some of the regulations, right, that came as a result, because of muckraking journalism like The Jungle, or, because of people like Wiley, right, the Meat Inspection Act, right? Meat has to be sanitary, right? It has to be at a certain temperature. It has to be located here. Where did the animals come from, right? All of these different things. These standards were meant to keep people safe. Same thing with the Pure Food and Drug Act, right? Or otherwise known as the Wiley Act. You can't just say things on certain types of food, and you have to let people know what's in it, right? You can't just put food in there and just be like, oh, just label it as sardines and it's actually, rat meat, right? You got to know what is inside of it. What's the content? And even what's very interesting is that, you can go to a fast food restaurant now and you can actually see the calories that are listed on there. They actually list the ingredients on the side. There's usually somewhere on the wall. Well, 15 years ago, that wasn't there, right? That's yet another example of people asking and demanding that they know what's in their food, right? They want to know what is going into this. What am I putting into my body, right? And you have other people in terms of regulations that are happening, such as like what Secretary RFK is doing right now with inverting the pyramid and pushing more consumption of red meat and, full fat dairy, right? All those sort of aspects. So, thankfully to the muckrakers. Otherwise, there's other things that did come as a result of this, is that especially with child labor. Um, by 1900, about 20% of children are working, right? And they're under the age of, 16. So we're talking about children as young as, 5 or 6, that are working. Children often were, desired by companies because you could pay them half as much. You didn't necessarily have to worry about, any sort of rules or laws. There was no child labor, rules. But, when it becomes exposed that have people that are taking pictures of young children coming out of coal mines or working on looms or, are, literally covered in some sort of, filth or grime because of the conditions that they're working in, this gets people, looking and feeling some sort of way. If we look at the picture of the young little boy and the bunny rabbit, I'm forgetting what his name was, but, or is, excuse me. the photographs can do a lot for you. And, muckrakers and photojournalists really pushed people to adopt these standards to not have child labor, that people like Lewis Hine, who documents these images of children, this gets out into the public and people are like, no, we've got adults is one thing, but children, we need to have some sort of limitations here, in terms of what can be done. And so, this is also another period of, regulation and it will take some time, but, this is one of those areas. But you see like Lewis Hine in terms of his images here, you see these young girls, you see like the kids on the looms. I mean, they're standing on them. I mean, they're not even tall enough in which to regulate, to pull these massive machines that are, 6 feet high, if they stand on them. But they're working in steel mills, they're working in coal mines, they're working in looms. I mean, this is what's happening, and we're documenting this as a way to, regulate it. Finally, what I want to end with in terms of the progressive era is the fight for suffrage, right? The right for women to vote. Where exactly does that come from? Well, Abigail Adams, who was the wife of John Adams, our second president, asked, as they were coming up with a new government and a new, system of regulation and a Declaration of Independence and a constitution, Abigail Adams was, her husband's most trusted advisor. And she really pushed this idea that, don't forget us, we have a voice. She was highly educated. She spoke Latin. This is a woman, who, could, have the best debates with any of them. And so she felt that, women were capable of being in these spaces and capable of making these decisions because look at all the decisions that they had to make, whether it was, trying to survive, and run a home, to be able to raise children, to be able to deal with all these things and these politics. And, when as men play politics in terms of these issues, women, as Abigail Adams pointed out, lived the politics, right? And so you had individuals, especially before the Civil War, Stanton and Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, at the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848, they come up with the Declaration of Sentiments, very similar to, the Declaration of Independence. It's, written in terms of that sort of fervor. But this idea that, suffrage for women, it really just wasn't something that, that people really had a taste for. Women seen as, as voters and as participants in the political, fray, was just something that, just turned many people off, both men and women. And, it's the suffrage movement, and I'll put up the documentary up there on the vote so you guys can see it on there. I'm sorry, it should be already on there. It should be on the vote. Take a look at it. Take a look and see where women, were really limited in terms of their opportunities. I mean, when you don't have the right to vote, you don't have the right to own property, you don't have the right to divorce, you don't have the ability in which to, decide what happens to your children. You can't be employed, you can't work for wages, right? Your money, if you are employed, goes to your husband. There's all sorts of issues here. Like this is very, troublesome, for women. And so when we think about, what women have achieved now, I mean, the fact that we had a woman vice president, that we had, a woman who ran for president, two women that have run for president, Geraldine Ferraro ran for vice president, Shirley Chisholm ran for vice president, right? We've had women that have achieved these opportunities and, have stepped into these positions, as a result of having the right to vote. And so, take a look at that. It's very important to be able to understand that. But especially during this period of the progressive era, women change, right? Remember all that rapid change that's happening technologically, that rapid change that's happening industrially, rapid change. Well, there's also this change that is happening as a result of women in terms of their access, right? Opportunities. Because that labor force that we talked about, 50% of the wages, that 50% of the people are earning their wages. Well, about 1/5 of that labor force was women, right? They're working, right? Women are deciding that, you know what? I think I'm going to work. Women are deciding that, you know what? I think there's something more to life, right? The clothing style changes. Women have the ability in which to, ride bicycles and exercise and go swimming, right? They going to school, right? They're delaying marriage, right? They're joining reform movements. They're getting more organized, right? All of these different aspects are converging during this period. And this is what you get in terms of the new woman, right? This idea that women are far more liberated, right, than they had been. I mean, smoking a cigarette in public. These are, behaviors that were just not associated with women prior to this period, right? It was very rather uncouth, right? But now you would see women riding bicycles and exercising and going out and dancing and smoking cigarettes, right? This idea that the new woman is somebody who is far more involved in determining her own outcomes and not reliant on men. Okay. And so this is what is this combination, especially in the early 1900s, in this progressive era, that's really pushing this reform that women ought to have their voice, right? Because of all the changes that were happening, women were starting to assert themselves in far more organized ways than they were before. And so this new approach that they are taking, which is, you know, embodied by several different women. Harriet Stanton Blatch is one of them. Uh, what is the other woman's name? Alice Paul is another one. These are individuals and women that are organizing far differently than they were, right? These are women who are deciding to go and speak and convince men that they deserve the right to vote, that they're creating leagues to where they can go and, picket, where they can create opportunities and decide that, you know what, we're going to expose ourselves and put ourselves out there to demonstrate how much we are willing and capable of this right to vote, right? With this responsibility. And so when you have tactics, right? One of the most important tactics was the ones that were brought by Alice Paul. You have Stanton Blatch creating organizations and speaking tours and state by state campaigns to be able to change the right to vote at the state level. Because remember, it is states that decide who gets to vote. And so you had Alice Paul, who decided that, you know what, we'll work within that framework, but she was much more aggressive in her tactics, things that many women were just like, I'm not sure about this. We're talking about hunger strikes. We're talking about, breaking windows and, protesting, canvassing, picketing, right? She was actually one of the first people to really put publicity out there to draw attention, right? To keep suffrage on the front page by being a spectacle, right? If you can get attention out there, however you can get it, and determine it that way, this is going to get people to think about this issue. And, this is one of the things that you had these two different goals that were going on with the approach to suffrage. So you had state campaigns which, is this idea that you got to get a constitutional amendment on each state constitution to get women the right to vote. Now, at the time in the 1900s, you only had a couple of states where women could get the right to vote: Wyoming, Washington, right? But many states, the opportunities had failed, right? So the idea is that you can work at the state level, you can convince state legislatures, you can get to know the people, know their families, and then you can get them to vote and be able to make the change. Problem is that it takes forever and a day to get this done, right? It's very expensive. If it fails, which it did, for many, many times, is that it's very difficult. The other approach was to do something federally. Let's just get a federal amendment to the Constitution. This would make a sweeping change across the country, and then everybody is going to get the right to vote like that. Problem is that you got to get not just both houses to agree on this legislation, but then you got to get 2/3 of the states to vote on it. So it's the same thing again, right? It's like, well, even if we do state by state campaign, we're still going to have to get the states, anyways, if we do the federal amendment, right? And so this is what you have is you have these two different camps and you have these two different approaches by two different women's groups, right? You have the National Women's Party and you have the National American Women's Suffrage Association. So the National Women's Party is run by the new woman, right? This is the Alice Pauls of the world, right? These are the women who are like, you know what, we're doing the federal amendment. We're going to be picketing. We're going to be doing these aspects. And then you have the National American Women's Suffrage Association, or NASA. This is the one that's doing the state by state campaign, right? And so this is by Carrie Chapman Catt and these aspects. But what's very interesting is if you see that picture down there at the bottom, right? Both at the bottom. Those are women picketing in front of the White House. Those are members of the NWP, the National Women's Party. And this was done by Alice Paul. Her idea was is that let's picket in front of the person, the House, the group that can change all of this, the president. This was the first time in history that this had ever been done. No other organization had ever done this, and it was done by women. Okay? Very radical. Why? Because women don't display themselves in such a way, and they certainly don't picket in front of the White House. My God, this is just so unbecoming of a woman, right? And so what ends up happening is that they get arrested basically for blocking the traffic or some nonsense, but it doesn't stop. They stage pickets in front of the White House until a federal amendment is passed. So we're talking several years here, people. Remember, federal amendment doesn't get passed until the 19th Amendment, which doesn't get ratified until 1920. Okay? These women start picketing in front of the White House in 1916. So we're talking about a period of 4 or 5 years of just standing out in front all day, every day until that happens. So you see how cold it is outside right now? Imagine standing outside there, okay? And in in frigid cold weather, right? This was their approach, but it's keeps people looking, keeps people, aware. And what's very interesting is that the banners that they would put up usually quoted the president. This time it would be Woodrow Wilson. And, as a way to just say, like, well, here's a man who preaches equality, who preaches opportunity, who preaches, freedom, but not all citizens are free in this country. Not all citizens have the right to vote. Not all citizens get the opportunity, right? And this was one of the aspects of it is that, women's suffrage, right, really demonstrated women in terms of this ability to organize. Let me just put that down there so you can see the thing. Right. And you can actually, click on these aspects in terms of both groups. It actually breaks it down, to look at these different aspects of suffrage. And, you can also look at the picketing of the president. There's actually nice video right here in 1917 when the war has started. This is from the film Iron Jawed Angels, which is a, popular cultural, Hollywood remake of, the women's suffrage movement. Kind of cute. I mean, there's a couple of things in there that are historically accurate. Others are, just made for, good television and movies and good feelings like that. But, it does get at the actual aspect of the idea of women, you know, fighting for more rights, which I think is, the essential characteristics of the United States and the characteristics of America. This idea that you have the right to protest for more rights. And there it is. Okay. In terms of the why that its suffrage stalled, we had this aspect. I'm not going to get into too much detail about this, but because there was this other aspect known as the temperance movement. So the temperance movement is what actually contributed to the suffrage movement. And you can take a look at, the temperance movement and these aspects because temperance really begins, you know, like in the 1840s and 1850s. But the problem with temperance, and if you guys are not familiar with this, I may just do a separate lecture on this one. But just let me just give you some background, and you can actually watch the video right here on the temperance movement, and I'll actually put up the link uh for the video on that. But temperance movement essentially is this. Um, Americans drink a lot of alcohol, like a lot of alcohol at the time. Drinking, um, in the United States, there's a long history of it. I mean, we're talking like a long history. When starting with like the Pilgrims arriving on the Mayflower in 1609 in 1610, right? We're talking about like the hull of the Mayflower was filled with beer. President, General Washington, later President Washington, when he had his troops, they were all given 1 cup of rum a day. They were given and if when the rum ran out, there was whiskey. People in the Northeast would have cider, literally like a barrel of cider at their door, and they would just, drink it like this. But at the time prior to like mass production of alcohol, most beer was like, 2 or 3%. But when you have the development of stills that can produce concentrated alcohol from wheat and barley and rye. This makes concentrated alcohol that's much stronger. So we're talking, something in the range of like 15 to 17 to 20%, right? So, drinking this, remember at the time, the United States, there was like times to just drink during the day. People would drink in the morning, they drink in the afternoon, they drink in the evening. So how does this affect suffrage? Well, so at the time when marriages were happening, and this is just really succinctly speaking. So women didn't have rights. Okay. Men were the ones who made all the decisions in terms of money. They made the decisions in terms of, living. They made the decisions. So men would go out. There would often, if we can look at some of these letters, this idea of, um, you know, uh, letters in terms of like women worrying about Friday night because they knew that Friday nights is when men went out to just drink and that they would come back that evening and they would just be a terror. They would beat them up, they'd beat the children up, right? And many women were just in these abusive relationships and abusive households. Of course, there wasn't a name for it back then, but if you take a look at like this link, this image down here, this is basically how it starts in terms of the drinking, right? And men just became drunkards, right? They stopped going to work. They didn't produce enough money, families broken up, right? It was just terrible, right? So the idea of suffrage was a way for women to be able to assert and protect themselves, right, from this aspect. The temperance movement is born out of that. This idea that if we can get men to stop drinking, we can have a better system, better society, better families, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. So that's what eventually leads up to the 18th Amendment, which is the banning of alcohol, okay? And which will eventually lead to the 21st Amendment, which means that you can just drink whatever you want, right? But in between there, you have the 19th Amendment, which gives women the right to vote. So, when you think about temperance, and I won't go into too much about it, it's just that America has a long history of drinking, I mean, if we were to look at like what people used to drink in the 19th century, like per person, you know, um, it would be the equivalent of like somewhere like, 40 to 50 bottles of whiskey like a year. Like that's a lot of alcohol, to be drinking, on your own. That's a lot. And so when we think about alcohol, if you want to think about that, there is this relationship between the temperance movement and suffrage. Why did suffrage stall? Well, mainly because men felt that if women got in charge and they were believing in this temperance aspect and they voted, that they would just vote out the process of alcohol and that alcohol would disappear. Were they totally wrong about that? No, because the 18th Amendment did get passed, but eventually that didn't, there was underlay, what we would call bootlegging and, bathtub gin, and I'll get into all those, aspects, later. Okay. So, in terms of that, in terms of the aspects of the federal amendment and what it actually became a reality, you actually had Alice Paul and, the National Women's Party, really just using popular media, getting donations, public speaking, using parades, especially, as a way to demand, the right to vote. the right to vote. And so, when we look at women, in terms of this aspect, what I really want you guys to think about is how the progressive era really enacts people, when they see some wrongdoing, when they see something that they want to change, they really act upon it. Whether that's, Alice Paul in terms of voting, Ida B. Wells in terms of lynching, the muckrakers in terms of, poison and food control and X, Y, and Z. You know, think about how that mirrors where we are today and how you could be an activist and how you could be a change. Because I think we are living in a very similar period, that this is a period where, there is opportunity to make a difference, whether it's at a local level, whether it's, just somewhere in your neighborhood, your family, or maybe it is at the state level, or maybe at the national level. But I think we're living in a very parallel period of time where there's an enormous amount of change, but also enormous amount of opportunity to change. So take a look at that. If you guys have any questions or any comments or concerns, feel free to email me, text me, call me. But yeah, I look forward to seeing you guys' responses. All right.